Hi everybody, and thanks so much for joining me today for the closing keynote of WorkNet. My sincerest thanks to Valerie Schaefer for the introduction to this virtual session, to Niels Brugger for the invitation, and to Helle Strandgaard Jensen as well for inviting me to give a CEDAR workshop, which unfortunately also needed to be scrapped. Hopefully it can be rescheduled at some point, as I'm such a big fan of what happens at Aarhus University, as you've all seen throughout this great event, WorkNet. So let me begin. What I'll be speaking about today through slides, it won't just be my big face in front of you in videos and other great things, is you shouldn't need to be a web historian to use web archives, or how to lower barriers to access through community and infrastructure. I'll speak for about 30 or 40 minutes. I'm cognizant that it can be a bit draining to be watching our screens so much, and then I'll join you all live for questions and answers shortly. It of course goes without saying that I hope you're all staying safe and healthy as I address an international audience. I'm here in my home in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, with 2 kids and my partner, and we are all good, if occasionally a little bit stir crazy, and I hope that all of you are staying safe, staying healthy, and of course for most of us, staying at home. It's a strange time that this comes to you as a special remote edition, but I'm happy that we've been able to have such a productive gathering, even mediated through technology. And I'm looking forward to perhaps it's beer for some of you, coffee for me as it's the morning here in Canada, and looking forward to a discussion with you all very shortly. Well, let's dive in. Here's my plan for what we'll be covering over the next 30 or 40 minutes. I want to start by talking a little bit about what the problem with web archives is. Why should we want to rise to this challenge? Hopefully, if you're at WorkNet, you're a receptive audience. But then I want to talk a little about what we can do. What does this mean in terms of skills? What does this mean in terms of new ways to deliver data or new ways to understand data? I'll talk about this then through the prism of a project that I help lead, the Archives Unleashed project. Present 3 different user personas, and then talk about how this can all come together into a sense of building community to develop web archives tool and infrastructure. Now, I am aware that I'm standing between all of you and a virtual coffee, a virtual beer, sleep, morning, kids, etc. So I will try to be snappy and fun. Perhaps it's not as bad as standing between you and an actual celebration, but still, I'm very cognizant of the limitations we have. So let's begin. So what is the problem with web archives? Well, I'll tell you what the problem with web archives isn't. The problem with web archives is not really that we can't collect enough. If we start looking at the numbers of just how much data the Internet Archive and other institutions have, it's pretty remarkable. For example, in what is undoubtedly, every time I change these slides, it gets outdated. So I'm just going to go with this. The shorthand is they have a lot of data. But the Internet Archive, let's say they have 635 billion plus URLs, hundreds of billions of documents, and that totals something around 40 petabytes. Now, if we take national libraries around the world, from North America to Europe to Asia to Africa, we can probably roughly guess that we have about the same as the Internet Archive once over. So we have at least 80 petabytes of web archival data. And so I could be a bit provocative here and to posit that web archive capture is more or less a quote-unquote solved problem. Now, this is not to trivialize things. There are serious problems with harvesting, etc. There's lots of labor involved. It's a cat and mouse game. Web developers invent something. Web archivists have to catch up. But I think in general we can understand the collection and capture side of the sort of web archive lifecycle as more or less solved. As I say here on the slide, in general, we understand how a researcher, a curator, or a librarian can scope out a collection. They could say, hey, let's collect websites germane to COVID-19, and they can use tools such as ArchiveIt or Heritrix, etc. to download them. I'm fine if you want to push me this on the question and answer. So the problem with web archives is not actually making web archives. The problem with web archives is making use of web archives. The problem is rather that we just don't know what to do with all the data that we've collected. And so I would say that if collection is solved, the problem that I think groups like WorkNet and others need to rise to is the problem of analysis. We don't know what to do with nearly 100 petabytes of data that we've so expensively curated and more expensively committed to preserving in perpetuity. What happens when a researcher has a question? How can they answer it? We collect all this data and we don't know how to meaningfully leverage it. Now you might be saying, what about the Wayback Machine? It's good enough, isn't it? Well, yes, the Wayback Machine is good enough for lots of queries. As I say here, the Wayback Machine is truly great if you know what you're looking for. And you'll see here as I talk, I'll run a quick query for GeoCities. The keyword search is getting better and better. The difference functions where you can take, say, the EPA pre-Trump and the EPA post-Trump and compare them. It's a phenomenal piece of software, and we underestimate it, really to our great detriment. But if the Wayback Machine is really, really good at playback, the Wayback Machine is not good enough for sort of detailed advanced queries. You might say, I want websites that say climate change and link to the United Nations. You might want to do exploratory text mining. You might want to work with images or text en masse. And that's where the Wayback Machine isn't enough. And then instead, we need to work with web archives as data. We need to work with them at scale. Now, I think this is probably the first event in history to be called work. So many of you probably know what a work file is. But the work file, as we see here, is an ISO standard, 28500:2009. It's basically a container file format to take all of the moving parts that make up a web capture and put them into one place so you don't have millions of files on your system. Now, I don't talk about ISO standards just to be a wonk, but to really stress that standardization has enabled such a vibrant ecosystem to begin to emerge around the study of web archival objects. That a Danish web archive and a Canadian web archive and a Chinese web archive and a Japanese web archive and a South African web archive and a Chilean web archive and a web archive created by somebody in Waterloo in their basement on webrecorder.io, all of them end up in the work format. And that means that they're interoperable when it comes to replaying in a Wayback Machine, but they're also interoperable when it comes to analyzing them with software. Now, the downside to the work format is that even though it's standardized, it's very hard to use. It's idiosyncratic. It's only really used by a small handful of web archive researchers and web archive collecting institutions. If you go on to Stack Overflow or go to your local university library if you work at a university, people don't know what work files are. And so the first step is, as we'll talk about, is to work with work files, but the first step is often to take the data out of the work file and put it into something that you understand. But what does it mean if I say on this slide, we need to work with works as data? Well, it means a few things. It means that suddenly we have to be able to work with, hundreds of terabytes of data. Terabytes begin to lose meaning when you work with web archives. The data is just that big. Hundreds of gigabytes, and we're talking about smaller collections. Single-digit gigabytes, and, it's a crawling test, basically. So it means that if we want to work with web archives as data, if we want to move beyond replay, we have to be able to work with lots of data. We have to be able to use specialized software. And once you get into these sort of big data world, suddenly you're not using shiny graphical user interfaces, but you're beginning to use the command line. And I'll show you some spooky command line stuff in a minute. And crucially, you begin to realize that the Wayback Machine is so powerful because it works, and that moving beyond replay is incredibly difficult. So we have a big challenge. Why is it worth us learning to work with hundreds of terabytes of data, to learn about ISO standardized work files, to use obtuse tools and derivative file formats? Why should we do that? Well, because web archives are awesome. Here we are, we're all mostly sitting in our homes. Let me give you a burst of energy at the end of WorkNet and remind us all why web archives are the best. Why are they so awesome? They are so awesome because it's not just information that's big. It's not just the hundreds of billions of documents. It's not just the dozens and dozens of petabytes. It's the interesting information that's part of that data. As I say here on this slide, I like to think of scale and scope. And scope is what makes me very, very excited, because it's data that never before that would have been collected is now being collected about people who aren't traditionally in the historical record. I sometimes use an example of myself. I posted on Usenet when I was an 11-year-old boy. If I'm sitting in Denmark, or I'm sitting in England, or I'm sitting in France, and I use something in that national domain to write about my love of a board game, even if I'm an 11-year-old, that ends up in the National Library. That's phenomenal for historians. And I think we underpin that, because when we start to think, could you do a study of the 1990s, or a study of the 2000s, or a study of the 2010s, or the 2020s, which is hard to believe we're here, it's hard to imagine really doing a historical study or many other topics without using this immeasurable trove of data. I use historical examples here because I'm a historian, but, could you do a political history of, the 1996 election in the United States? Or the response to the attacks of September 11th? Or beyond? Not just political parties, but politics between elections. Could you do that without using web archives? Could you write a social history? A history of labor unionization, of class, of gender, or economic histories, looking at the dot-com boom, or cultural histories, looking at the rise of the smartphone, or the emoji, or the pocket pet, etc., etc. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that you couldn't do justice to any of these topics, that you wouldn't at least benefit immeasurably from using web archive, unless you actually use web archives. So we have a serious problem. On the one hand, researchers will need to use web archives. On the other hand, we have the Wayback Machine, and once you want to go beyond it, you can't actually do that with the tools and supports that we currently have. Still awake? So, what can we do to rise to this challenge? Well, I would argue that it requires 3 new things. We need new skill sets, we need new ways to deliver data, and we need new ways to understand data. And in the next section of this talk, I want to tackle each of these 3 critical dimensions in turn, starting with first, what new skills do we need to rise to this challenge? The first new skill set we need to work with web archives is the ability to work with data at scale. Now, what does this look like? Well, it requires the basics of an understanding of the basics of natural language processing, or NLP, the process by which we take text that's not written for computers, but is written for humans, stories, novels, blogs, tweets, and try to use computers to make sense of them. We'd also need basic statistical knowledge to work with quantitative data. Once we start working with terabytes of data, or hundreds of terabytes of data, suddenly you're confronted with all sorts of statistical questions. How often is something significant that it's mentioned? How do we normalize frequency over shifting bodies of documents, etc., etc.? And then, of course, we need some flexible data science skills. And I jokingly put on the slide here the ability to go to Stack Overflow. But that really actually is a skill. To use these programs requires some basic level of computational literacy so that when it breaks, you know what to Google to get it working again. In other words, a combination of knowing NLP, knowing basic statistics, having flexible data science skills, means that a researcher can be equipped with the skills and capacities to analyze text and data at scale. So that's skill set 1, working with data at scale. Skill set number 2 is we need to have an understanding of how data is constructed. So a researcher also needs to have a solid understanding of how and why was data collected, i.e., why did this website end up in the web archive and this website did not? If we know the answer to that question, we can trust the data when it comes to writing and researching with it. And if we don't, how do we know whether we're measuring something that's an artifact of the archive, not an artifact of the underlying reality the archive seeks to represent? This also means we have to know what data wasn't collected and how the software used to create the dataset changed over time. Maybe comments weren't collected until 2009 in a crawl, and so if you're doing text analysis and suddenly you start seeing lots of stuff from the comments pop up in 2009, you might think again something has changed dramatically, but really it was just a different crawler that was able to crawl more data. And then some very basic skills, and I put them here, cleaning and normalizing data. We run into this all the time. We collect a website, maybe the crawler in 1 year called it www.ndp.ca, in year 2, www.ndp.ca, but on HTTPS. And on the third year, just ndp.ca without the leading www. I look at those, I say, those are the same website. The computer won't unless we teach it. So we have these skills. We need to have the ability to work with data at scale. We need to understand how data is constructed. And of course, we need to add on the skills that we've already gotten like PhDs in, such as the skill set of a historian or a social scientist or a humanist. So if we take stock at this moment here, we can see that our story is getting increasingly complicated. Web archives exist, but analyzing them is too hard. Existing tools to analyze them work. Historians need to do this, but maybe we're asking too much of them. So should we give up? Well, it wouldn't be much of a closing keynote to a web archiving workshop if my message was that we should give up. So it's not much of a surprise that when someone asks me, should we give up? I stand on the mountaintop and I yell no. We need to drive on. Well, if we're not going to give up, what can we do? Here's where I want to pivot a bit to talk about some of our work, as we've been trying to tackle this problem since 2015 with our Archives Unleashed project, which is run under the University of Waterloo here in Waterloo and York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'll show you some smiling faces in a bit, but I did want to note that the Archives Unleashed project isn't just me. It's also my colleague Jimmy Lynn at Waterloo, Nick Rouet at York University, and our amazing project manager, Samantha Fritz at Waterloo. I'll talk a little bit about our tools, but first, I want to talk a little bit about how a scholar might even begin to approach the question of working with the web archive. A problem, again, we've been working on since 2015. Through our work with the Archives Unleashed project, based on working with scholars at 7 datathons, I guess including our 8th online COVID-19 datathon, 8 datathons, and numerous workshops, we've developed an approach that we see scholars using when they work with web archives. We sketched out a potential process cycle first as something we call the FAAV or FAV cycle, which we've changed slightly as you see here as the FEAV or FEAV cycle. And you can read about our approach in a forthcoming JCDL paper that's also up on Archive. And I'll tweet a link. Basically, when we look at web archives, we see that they do the same 4 things over and over again. And so the FEAV cycle shows us that a researcher comes to a web archive and begins by filtering data. We keep talking about hundreds of terabytes. People don't want to work with hundreds of terabytes. They want to filter down the web archive in many cases to what they're really interested in. Maybe that's 90 terabytes. Maybe that's 1 terabyte. Maybe that's the Danish top-level domain. Maybe that's a certain year, a certain date, another domain. Something of interest. Websites containing the words climate change. You can begin to imagine how you could filter it down fairly quickly. Then you extract the information that you want. Maybe you extract the plain text. Maybe you extract the hyperlink structure. Maybe you extract all the images that appear on websites. Then we aggregate. That's where we're clustering. We're, finding out the website that has the most links to it, the most links from it. We're taking all that data and putting it together. And then we usually finish by visualizing it somehow. Now, this allows for complicated research queries using something like Apache Spark. And our Archives Unleashed toolkit is based off this cycle. The Archives Unleashed toolkit, which I'll show you, basically takes these 4 steps and lets a researcher implement that on the work files. Now, you're probably all really, really, really excited because you want to do this on your web archives yourself. And I say, check out our cool interface and drum roll, please. Well, here's how we let people work with web archives. Now, the Archives Unleashed toolkit is easy to use as long as you know how to use the command line, how to access a server, how to use the Spark shell or Spark submit, how to code at least somewhat in Scala or maybe Python as we expand that functionality, and crucially have a lot of patience for open source documentation and beyond. If we were all sitting in the large auditorium at Aarhus, maybe I'd ask you all to have your hands up, and every time you weren't comfortable with one of these steps, to put down your hand. And I would wager we might have 10% of the audience still comfortable to use this. And so the problem with this is that we studied how scholars would use web archives. We developed a toolkit to help service it. And starting in 2015, we had this approach, and we found that it wasn't too easy to use. And we found it wasn't too easy to use also because historians, at the same time we were trying to get them to use this toolkit to analyze web archives, historians were actually turning away from numbers. I like to use this just as a quick example. We might take the introductory historiography textbook, John Tosh, The Pursuit of History. When I teach the course at University of Waterloo, I use John Tosh. If you look at the first or second edition, they have an entire chapter on quantitative history. And by the 5th edition, and now into the 6th, there's no quantitative history at all. And James Baker, who pointed this all out in a wonderful blog post on the British Library's digital blog, argued that nevertheless it is curious that at a time when both the youth of and the breadth of humanities data is growing, parenthetically like we see here with web archives, quantitative skills are no longer a core component of our undergraduate history programs. So we have a problem. We have a great toolkit that can let people use web archives, but historians don't want to use numbers, they don't have technical skills, and quite frankly, it's on us. We made a user interface that people don't want to use. So if we truly believe that working with web archives is a worthwhile endeavor, we need to do something more than just give them command line tools. In other words, researchers need to use web archives. Hopefully I've convinced you of that. We developed a tool, and it was a tool that did not line up well with our users. So the problem is still there, except now we've added one more wrinkle. Researchers need to work with web archives, they need to have skills, existing tools aren't enough, and to that we can add the Archives Unleashed toolkit was not enough. But we want to do this. So we need more community. And we need more infrastructure. And so I want to show you what this might look like in a few easy steps to get over the problem of historians who don't have the skills and to move past platforms that aren't good enough. Well, step one is the Archives Unleashed toolkit used works. And step one is usually try to get works out of the way. I mentioned this earlier, works are awesome, but honestly the user community is too small. You need to find a way to turn works into derivative datasets. And these derivative datasets look a little bit like this. You might take all of the text of a web archive and call that the full-to-text derivative dataset. Then a scholar can use text analysis software. They can go to their library. They can go to Stack Overflow and say, I have lots of text. Help me. You can extract the hyperlinks and make a social network of what domain links to what domain. How do these things change over time? And then you can use network software like Gephi. You might want to extract the images. Okay, I want every image from the Danish state broadcaster in 2015. And then suddenly you have 1 million images, but you can actually go to places where people have said, what can you do with 1 million images? Binary files, maybe you want all the PDFs. There's great stuff where you take all the PDFs from a web archive and have a PowerPoint karaoke file, or take all the PowerPoint files or all the Word docs or all the executable files. In short, the idea is to extract anything that might suit your research question and turn it into something usable. But even then, when it comes to working with this sort of data, there's too big a gap between the tools and users. And so if I was in an actual room, I'd be jumping around the stage and hopefully not falling off of it to vividly illustrate this. But basically I would say we have researchers over here, and the web archives are over here, and they're simply too far apart. So what can we do? Well, we have a few different options. Historians can become programmers. Tools can move all the way to historians, or everybody can meet in the middle? Well, we can see that if we think about those three sort of options, the option that should historians become programmers, should tools move towards historians, should everybody move towards the middle, we can actually begin to line those up to personas. If historians are to become programmers, we can look to the computational humanities. If tools are to move entirely towards historians, we can think of these as conventional historians, who use ProQuest or JSTOR. And if we see some give and take where tools become more accessible, but so too do scholars make a good faith effort to engage with technology, perhaps the digital humanities are the way forward. Now, we framed our Archives Unleashed project around these three personas. The persona of how could we serve a conventional historian, how could we serve a digital humanist, how can we serve a computational humanist. And that framing can actually be seen in the core of our mission statement, which is we think broadly about our audience when we say Archives Unleashed aims to make petabytes of historical internet content accessible to scholars and others interested in researching the recent past. And indeed, our team lines up with these three rough approaches too. I'm a conventional historian, but I'm quite computational. My colleague Nick Fruet at York University is a systems librarian who can develop amazing things. And of course, my colleague Jimmy Lin, a computer scientist here at Waterloo. And if our team takes an interdisciplinary spirit of trying to reach different audiences through our different skill sets and backgrounds, our tools line up with these personas too. Our toolkit aims squarely at the computational. The cloud aims at people who can work with lots of text, but of course don't necessarily want to become programmers. And the notebooks, which I haven't spoken about yet, but I'll touch on briefly, are a way to try to broaden our net to reach a much more wider audience of regular, quote-unquote, conventional historians. So let's talk a little bit about these personas. So persona A, the computational humanist, and there's going to be a great now virtual workshop in Amsterdam in the fall looking at the computational humanities. And I often like to think of the computational humanist as someone who is comfortable installing packages. They know what a package is, they can install your thing, they don't need great documentation, they can understand how to install dependencies, they're fluent on the command line, and crucially, when they run into obstacles, like we all do, they know how to get themselves unstuck pretty quickly through Googling the error message and ending up on Stack Overflow. Now, when it comes to web archives, a computational humanist, to me, needs to be able to take works and extract derivatives. They can interpret technical documentation. They can troubleshoot error messages. We can give them a sample script, and they can swap out the inputs and the outputs. And crucially, they can use the command line. Now, the toolkit was designed around this persona. The toolkit allows a user to take works and do the following things. Determine basic stats about a collection, extract particular images, domains, URLs, pages with keywords, etc. Do a sophisticated network analysis. And I think crucially, if what you see in the documentation doesn't meet your needs, it is extendable, and they can work on extending it themselves. So let's see the Archives Unleashed toolkit in action. So here I am, I open up a terminal window. This will either give you a sense of how easy it is to use or how hard it is to use, but crucially it'll show you this kind of workflow we had in mind. So I'm going to open up Spark Shell. So I find that on my command line, I point it at the Archives Unleashed toolkit. While that loads up, I go over to the documentation, most recent documentation, and I can see what I can do with the Archives Unleashed toolkit. So I can analyze, find basic statistics about my collection, text analysis, link analysis, image analysis, and then binary analysis. Let's start with basic link analysis. I see here, list of URLs in the collection, list of domains in the collection. That sounds good. I take that over here, I copy it into my text editor, and I swap out the path, input path for where my file is. I copy and paste it. I go to my toolkit, I type paste, I paste it, then I press Control D. And you see here, this is mostly a file from archive.org, but there's a few other things in there too. And so this idea is more or less what we saw people doing with their web archives. So here, again, I'll paste one here. I change the input to example.arc.gz. I change the output to plain text Aarhus workshop. I copy and paste that all into here. Goes through, grabs the full text of that information, and in this case, actually saves it out to a CSV file. We see some little messages here about OCR. That's okay. We've got that CSV file to work with. Okay, so you got to see me do a bit of live coding there. Hopefully you were thinking, boy, that looks powerful, but that doesn't look that easy to use. And so that's where our big mistake of the Archives Unleashed project came in. The toolkit was our first product, and it was our first big mistake in that between 2015 and 2017, our project assumed that every historian who wanted to use a web archive could do exactly what you just saw on my screen. We said build it and they will come, download our software, change our example scripts, and work with their data. Now the problem with that is that computational humanists are like unicorns. They're cool to find, but don't base your strategy around them. Or in other words, we didn't do enough to narrow this gap. Researchers are over here, and the web archives are over here, and they're too far apart. So what then about the digital humanists? These are the sort of people we call digital humanists. They're comfortable with computers. They can use some off-the-shelf tools like Voyant or Gephi to work with text or networks, and can use tutorials like those of the programming historian to learn some basic Python or R. But they're probably not going to be firing up Apache Spark. And so this is when we started to think about the people we needed to actually try to broaden to expand to. That this kind of user needs to have some sort of toolkit to translate work files into something they can work with. They can think critically about data. They can use off-the-shelf tools to work with text or data, i.e. Voyant tools or Gephi. And the command line might work, but honestly, once we get them into like 17 dependencies to install to run something, they're going to give up. And so here is where we had designed something called the Archives Unleashed Cloud. The idea here was to allow a user to take their works and use a modern UI to sync their collections from the provider, run basic analysis in the browser to find major sites of interest, and download derivative file formats that integrate into their standard workflows. In other words, let's get the work out of the equation that's translated into standard files that a digital scholarship librarian could help people with. So here's the Archives Unleashed Cloud in action. I'm going to log in. Here I am, Ian Milligan. I'm logged in as Dalhousie University. Here's an archive collection, Nova Scotia Municipal Governments. You can see a hyperlink diagram. You can see an overview of what's in that collection. And crucially, you can actually zoom in and out to see how do different parts of the web archive connect to other parts in the web archive. You could take a screenshot. You could do all sorts of cool stuff. This is where you could download Gephi files, plain text files, top 10 domains, etc. Let me go to another collection here, one that I quite like. Artist Run Centers in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I like this. It's a simple collection. It's really just 3 seeds. We can actually see, zooming in, see that there's a common seed, canadahelps.org. Everybody links to it. It's in the middle there. Everybody links to it, but I wasn't actually part of it. That would help a librarian scope it. Crucially, here I download the plain text. We unzip the file. And then you can see, for example, there's that plain text from that web archive accessible for people to use. Now I think with this, we can see that we're moving towards our users, but it's still not any user because at the end of the day, you still get a bunch of data that you have to work with. It's just data that's in a slightly easier format to work with. Returning to that graph I keep coming back to, in other words, we're narrowing the gap. Web archives still have to make efforts, but so too do researchers. Researchers are here, web archives over here, but we're getting a little bit closer to each other. Now finally, we have the conventional scholar. The sort of scholar who might use computers, like for Word, some light Excel, but otherwise generally just wants to do historical research without learning new technical skills. Should we bother? Well, I joke, but it's the hardest group to serve. Because I'd say if in the toolkit we made the mistake of not going far enough to serve our users, we actually might have users, and this is a bit unpopular to say, maybe users actually need to put in the effort to come meet us. But because we're friendly, we're Canadians, we want to try, let's try, and we do this with what we call the Archives Unleashed notebooks. They're browser-based, they're play-tested. You can click with one click to deploy to play with Google Colab, and actually we have a workflow where data just gets hosted in the cloud on Zenodo. Boom, it connects to a Google Colab notebook. You're working in your browser right away. So here's an example of this in play. So let's see the Archives Unleashed notebooks in action. Here I am on the Archives Unleashed notebooks GitHub page, which is a little bit intimidating, but you actually don't even need to come here to use them. So here's an example of our notebooks. We have one that uses the Python data science module pandas, one that lets you use PySpark directly, and one that lets you do text analysis. So let's take a quick look at these. So here's one that works with all of the derivatives, in this case from a collection from the Quebec National Archives, and we can actually open it right up on a Google server. So I click Open in Colab. You'll see here it almost immediately opens up. Now we're running in the cloud, and we're actually running off data that's also hosted in the cloud. So this here lets you work with all of the derivatives that aren't the text. So you can see here it's similar to the Mad Libs. Here you would just change out this number here and you'd change the collection that you're working with. And you can see you can work with images, you can work with the web graph, which are how hyperlinks and domains link to each other within the web archive. And of course we can see images. This is where notebooks are cool. We could say, what's the most popular image? Boom, we see it's this image, an image of a fish, talking about erosion in a Ministry of Environment collection. And we can scroll down. We can actually even see, how did the crawl frequency change over time. Similarly, if we want to do text analysis, I open up this notebook again in the cloud, loads up very quickly, and we can see here what's word frequency. We can connect it to natural language processing. Remember NLP libraries to remove stop words, to do all sorts of cool processing. And I guess crucially, we can make a word cloud. I always like that. Get an overview of a collection very, very quickly. Now, it's still a bit difficult. You still need to program, but I think the fact that it runs in a browser, it's graphical, we can have text that explains what those cells need to do, gets us just one step closer to being able to work with these quote-unquote conventional historians. In other words, with the notebooks, the gap is narrowed as far as we can make it. Researchers are here, web archives are here, and the gap is as small as it can be. Well, that's infrastructure. What about community? Well, I'm conscious of time, so I just want to give this a very brief overview, and I'll provide a link to some further reading. But we've been also trying to build community as part of the Archives Unleashed project since the beginning of our datathons in 2016, which was renewed by Mellon Foundation funding in 2017. What we try to do is bring together groups of scholars, roughly a third historians / social scientists / humanists, those with research questions, a third from the curatorial side and collection side, and a third from the tools development and computer science side. And we try to get people to come together to talk about what are your research questions? What platforms and infrastructure are you interested in working with? What kind of data would you want to do? So we take data sets, we take cool people, we get them together, we feed them, we have social events, and crucially we get together to try to build community and figure out what it is we need to add if we're going to make this all work. We have a paper which I'll provide a link to and also tweet about. It basically, with the goal of our datathons, is we're trying to lower barriers. We're trying to bring people together, usually physically, although the last one was virtual, and crucially establish a community of practice to work with web archives. And recently at Columbia University, we hosted our first virtual datathon, and we actually have a piece on this under review right now. This was due to COVID-19, but we really are now thinking about how can we design events online, how can we be prepared, and crucially, how can we maybe use this as a way for our small community to work more online, so we don't have to fly across oceans to work with web archives. We can try to build this community together. Because ultimately, our goal with these tools and then with our datathons is to find a way to build community in all shapes and sizes, a goal that I'm sure is shared by WorkNet. And ultimately, Archives Unleashed and our broader community, I think, need to be motivated by 3 key points. We need to understand that historians in the future will need to understand the web. That was the focus of the first bit of my presentation. That they're not ready to do so, the focus of the next part of this keynote. And then finally, hoping to leave you on a hopeful note to say that let's make sure that they can. Let's make sure we have the tools and infrastructure and community there so we can rise to this challenge. This is going to come in several shapes and sizes. Part of it is new usable tools, i.e. tool makers coming towards researchers. Part of it is new cultures in the humanities and social sciences, i.e. researchers coming towards tool makers. But overall, we need a shared vision that this sort of work is important, that we can't do what we want to do unless we find some sort of common ground. To return to that graph I've shown a few times, we need to shrink this gap. We need to make researchers and web archives come together, because if we can shrink this gap, if we can do it, it will be worth it. So I want to say at this point, thanks to you. I hope to see you all in person at some point soon. I joke here, all of my photos are of Archive libraries or museums. I'll send thanks to our funders, especially the Mellon Foundation, to WorkNet for helping to facilitate this, to our other funders in Canada. And crucially at this point, I'll come say hello, farewell one last time, and look forward to your questions. Me again. I just wanted to pop my face up here one last time to thank everybody again. Thanks to WorkNet, especially to Niels Brugger for his very kind invitation to speak to you, and to you all for being such a great audience. Hope that you all stay safe and healthy. Looking forward to gathering with you all in person soon, to participating in the question and answer, and to again, thank you very much for being part of this wonderful community that I'm so proud to be a member of. Thank you.